We are joined this evening by Dr. David Millard Haskell. David is a tenured professor and researcher in the area of social and cultural trends. He's here tonight representing the Waterloo Region chapter of FAIR, the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. Using his expertise in the area of social science, David will be debunking the claims of critical race theory, anti-racism instruction, and white privilege lessons with facts and evidence. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium Dr. David Millard Haskell.
Oh, thank you very much. And good evening, everyone. I guess you just heard that tonight my presentation will focus fairly heavily on research. And now research, when it's credible, lets us predict outcomes. Research says that this problem can be solved by this method. No doubt you're familiar with that kind of approach. One time or another, all of us have been to the doctor when we've been sick. Maybe we're told by the doctor that if we take a particular medication, we'll be getting better. We're promised that if you do this, you'll get better. But you know, the history of medicine is littered with examples where the research justifying the use of a particular treatment was not credible. Well, how does that happen? Typically, that kind of fraud is perpetrated because the people doing the research, they ignore or they suppress any findings that contradict their desired conclusion. In some cases, the research wasn't even done. They simply make claims about the benefits of the product. And as I say, we can choose from thousands of examples of scholars or doctors promising that some treatment would make things better, when in fact it made things worse. But the biggest case of medical fraud ever was over a decade ago. And the drug company Pfizer was found guilty of lying about the safety of several of its most popular drugs. Pfizer said it had done the research, and the research had proved that their treatments would make things better. But that, in fact, was a lie. Court findings that were released in 2009 by the U.S. Department of Justice showed that Pfizer had omitted or suppressed evidence. Sometimes they just made things up. They even paid kickbacks to healthcare providers to prescribe the drugs that were faulty. Now, in the face of this massive lie, Pfizer was forced to pay $2.3 billion in fines. It was the largest fine that was ever paid by a drug company. You're saying, why is he telling us about this? It's because this story is instructive. It shows us that with enough political power and enough money, you can make a lie look like the truth, at least for a little while. But tonight is not about past fraud. It's about harmful fraud now in the present. I'll let you know, it's not just drug companies who promise a new way to make things better that actually makes things worse. Your education system is doing that to your kids. It's not just drug companies who suppress evidence to make things up, to trick people, to get them to do what they want. Your education system is doing that to your kids. And it's not just drug companies who offer payouts to professionals to push their faulty methods. Your education system is doing that, and it's your kids who are paying the price. In schools across the province, and in particular, the schools of our own Waterloo Region, there are two separate but equally fraudulent and harmful treatments. For now, I'm going to call them treatments, being prescribed to our students. The first treatment is radical gender ideology. The second treatment is critical race theory. Now, regarding the first, in Ontario, aspects of radical gender ideology are being taught to children as young as kindergarten. Parents are told this treatment, this new type of instruction, is needed because our schools are sick. They're sick with intolerance for the LGBT community. And they're also sick with outdated ideas about sexual activity, and outdated ideas about family, and outdated ideas about men and women. We're told our schools are sick in these areas, and we're told that instruction in radical gender ideology is the cure. Let me give some local examples. here in the Waterloo Board, administering the cure of radical gender ideology has meant that we've paid for drag queens to come and speak to students about academic success. It's meant some trustees will promote breast binding workshops at the public library, encouraging young girls to attend. It's meant that our director of education, in his public messages, replaces the word woman with the term people who menstruate. Of course, it's not just my local school board where this cure runs rampant. In other boards, the cure of radical gender ideology has meant that students get to see massively grotesque prosthetic breasts on their classroom teacher. And if the students or the parents complain about this distraction and indecency, well, the cure of radical gender ideology insists that they be shut down. Now, I'll stop there on gender ideology because we have someone here tonight who's better able to speak to the issue of radical gender ideology in our schools. Therefore, I'm going to leave that discussion to Carolyn Brzezinski, who will be speaking soon after me. For my part, I'm now going to focus on the second treatment being prescribed to our students. The second treatment, that is the second new type of instruction being forced on your kids, is critical race theory. But I'll let you know, our educators are now worried about using that term because it has been so thoroughly exposed as harmful. In fact, in my local board, Waterloo Region, and in many others, the term critical race theory, or CRT, has been replaced. It's been repackaged and presented as anti-racism education. But the two are one and the same. If you hear anti-racism instruction, it is critical race theory. Okay, a moment ago I explained radical gender ideology is justified by its supporters as a cure for a sickness in our schools. Well, critical race theory and anti-racism education is justified in the same way. Supporters say that our schools are sick with deep, pervasive racism, and CRT is the only cure. Now, we have to question that justification. How is it that schools are sick with deep, pervasive racism at a time when across North America, the large-scale empirical data shows racism has never been less of a problem? Survey data here in Canada from Angus Reid and Ipsos polling shows the lowest levels of racist sentiment in the general population ever. And it's equally true in the United States. Here's a graph created by the Dean of Social Science at Harvard University. His research is in race, on race. In a survey of white Americans, he asked questions like, would you mind if a person of color lived next door or married your child? And what his evidence shows, and you can see it for yourself in the graph that he created, racist sentiment among whites in the U.S. has never been lower, and it continues to drop. Now, I don't want you to misinterpret what I'm saying. I'm not saying that racism isn't real. Racism is real. And I can add to that. It's real, and it does real harm. But as I'm going to show you tonight, the claims our school leaders are making and what they're prescribing in our classrooms is overwhelmingly incorrect. The treatment they're proposing certainly doesn't solve racism, but it does make it worse. Now, in saying that, I'm actually getting ahead of myself. So let me outline the plan of my talk. I'm going to quickly explain what critical race theory is and how it's presented as anti-racism education. Then I'm going to show you how CRT and anti-racism instruction has penetrated all aspects of our Waterloo Region School Board, along with other school boards in our province. Finally, I'm going to show you what the best research, the research that our school boards have tried to suppress, reveals about that kind of instruction. So I mentioned that critical race theory has been receiving a lot of bad press because parents across North America see that it is destroying their schools. Parents in Canada are just now waking up. But for almost 2 years, moms and dads in the United States have been speaking out. And the reaction of those parents has been so loud and severe, CRT instruction is now illegal in over 35 states, banned in 35 states. So it makes you wonder, what do those parents know that you're not being told? Well, first off, critical race theory is actually not a theory at all, since a theory is supposed to be based on solid empirical evidence. Instead, it's more like a religion or a worldview, because in fact, CRT makes particular claims that they say are true. And the CRT claims they have a Marxist flavor, because in fact, CRT evolved out of Marxist ideology. In particular, the Marxist notion that society is divided into oppressors and the oppressed is taken up by CRT. But rather than applying those labels of oppressor and the oppressed according to, I guess what we'd call the original Marxist model of capitalists versus the good guy workers, with CRT, the labels of oppressor and oppressed are applied according to racial status. Specifically, whites are the oppressors and everybody else is oppressed. Also, borrowing from Marxism, critical race theory loves to change the meaning of words. It's done because they want to manipulate the public. They want you to hear a particular word and think a particular thing, but they're actually, it's like the magician who says, look over here, but not over here. It's misdirection. I'm going to give you an example. Here's the first example of how CRT redefines the term racism. For most of us, when someone is actually a racist, well, we'd hear that person say something about one group being superior and another being inferior, and it would be based on skin color. But now, according to CRT, racism is not just discovered through negative words and actions. Racism is primarily discovered anytime there is a difference in outcomes. Specifically, anytime people of color have a worse outcome than whites, CRT announces that's proof of racism. All other factors are ignored. If there is a difference and the outcome is worse, for people of color, they say racism is the explanation. Really? You see, it gets confusing because their model only works one way. Here's what I mean. 75% of NBA players are black and 25% are white. Now, that's a big deficit when it comes to NBA players who are white. But according to critical race theory, that kind of difference isn't racist. It's not evidence of racism. And of course, I would agree, you would agree. No, it isn't evidence of racism. Fewer whites in the NBA is not evidence of racism because clearly other factors besides racism explain the difference. But as soon as you get to those other factors, that's when the CRT true believers will stop listening. But I'm grateful. I'm grateful tonight to those listening via the live stream. I'm grateful to our packed house this evening because you are listening. And I want to tell you what the best empirical evidence shows about race and differences in outcomes. The short answer is this. In Canada and in the West generally, differences in socioeconomic outcomes are not driven by race. There are hundreds of studies I could cite. I'll give just one. In one of the largest and most recent studies of its kind, the British government pulled together top academics to study the effect that race has on education and income. It was just March last year, the report came out from the UK Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, and it concluded, quote, "The evidence shows that geography, family influence, socioeconomic background, culture, and religion have more significant impact on life chances than the existence of racism." So the actual evidence shows that many other factors, and not racism, are responsible for the differences we see in outcomes. Now, I have one more thing to explain about CRT and how it seeks to corrupt the meaning of words. In the same way that CRT corrupts the definition of racism, it also corrupts the definition of discrimination. Now, if you're my age, like me, you were taught any discrimination based on skin color is bad. It's a terrible thing. When Martin Luther King said that people should be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin, we took that as truth. But CRT rejects that truth. According to the main doctrines of CRT, discrimination based on skin color is to be encouraged sometimes. The idea appears in all their materials, but it's especially highlighted in the anti-racism instruction materials. Now, I know it can get confusing, but keep in mind that anti-racism instruction is CRT. It's just how the theory is packaged for students and the average person. So how does anti-racism instruction teach kids about discrimination? I want you to hear it from the horse's mouth. The top-selling instruction manual on the topic is the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's by Professor Ibram X. Kendi. Kendi completely rejects the idea of treating all people equally. Instead, he insists that to make society equitable, whites have to be denied equal treatment, and only they should be made to pay for historical misdeeds. He says, and this is a quote, "The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination." And all I can think is, what happened to do unto others? So, with that, I've briefed you on CRT and its public face, the public face known as anti-racism instruction. There's one more concept I want to explain, and it's white privilege. I know you may be familiar, so I'll try to go through this quickly. This all fits together, by the way, because the key elements of anti-racism instruction, one of the key elements is repeated lessons about white privilege. And during these lessons on white privilege, students are told that if they're white, the successes they experience are not primarily achieved through personal effort, but are bestowed on them because of their skin color. Conversely, students of color are taught, despite personal effort, their chances of success are significantly diminished because society as a whole is systematically racist and has turned against them. Now, can you imagine the psychological damage done to a student of color when teachers repeatedly tell them that in large measure their destiny is not in their own hands? So is it true? Is it true that people of color are held back in Canada? No. Research shows that students of color, especially those who are taught to believe that the world is not stacked against them and taught to believe that their personal actions drive their success, they will succeed fabulously. Year after year, Statistics Canada shows that Canadians of South and East Asian heritage, as well as those of several other non-white ethnic groups, achieve higher income and much higher educational attainment than whites in Canada. This is so contrary to the CRT narrative. We should not be surprised that white privilege lessons purposely avoid mentioning any of these facts. I've got one last thing to say about white privilege lessons. It's about unconscious bias. White privilege instruction seeks to convince white students that even if you hold no conscious animosity toward non-whites, unconsciously you embody racist tendencies. And those unconscious racist tendencies mean you can never escape your role as oppressor. And while you'll always be an oppressor, white students are told you can lessen your oppressiveness if you purposely give up opportunities. Giving up opportunities, allowing yourself to be passed over because of your skin color. It's given the positive euphemism, checking your privilege. All I can think is, when did being forced to the back of the bus become a good thing? Anyway, like most of the claims made in the name of critical race theory, the notion that you are unconsciously racist when your words and actions are not, that has been completely debunked. But just because it's not true doesn't mean that it's not being taught to your children. And on that note, You'll recall at the start that I promised I would briefly discuss how this divisive and faulty pedagogy has penetrated our school boards and classrooms. I'll now share a few examples. Just this summer, in mid-July, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario began distributing to teachers pre-made lesson plans on the topic of white privilege. With the help of this pre-made curriculum, about 90,000 elementary school teachers have been told to incorporate the ideas of CRT, anti-racism instruction, and white privilege into every subject that they can. Many teachers, to avoid getting into trouble, will oblige. Of course, many others are true believers, and they're simply more than willing. And I can tell you, in Waterloo Region, it feels like the teachers who are the true believers are slowly becoming the majority. And I'm basing that on the complaints from parents. As the chapter leader of FAIR, Waterloo Region, I hear many stories about lessons that pit one student against another, and it's all based on skin color. And what I'm hearing is peanuts compared to the complaints and concerns that Cindy Watson and Mike Ramsey have received from parents with kids in the WRDSB. If the names don't sound familiar, Cindy Watson and Mike Ramsey are the only trustees currently on the WRDSB who are willing to listen and to act on the concerns of parents about these kinds of issues. Both Mike and Cindy are long-time trustees, and as I said, they're known for their willingness to reject the radical ideologies in the classroom, and they're willing to stand up for parents. Well, they found that in the last year, complaints about divisive instruction has skyrocketed. In public statements made in local media, both Mike and Cindy explained that they've been hearing from hundreds of concerned parents. The parents are relaying stories of their children being taught discriminatory concepts that appear to be rooted in critical race theory. To address this outpouring of concern from parents, Mike and Cindy, as trustees, brought forward a motion. They did what they were supposed to do. As requested, they requested that school board staff research the issue and provide a detailed account of what students are being taught. In particular, their motion asked that staff would answer some specific questions related to how critical race theory was influencing instruction. And it especially wanted clarification about what was being taught about the concept of white privilege. Mike Ramsey wasn't able to be at that board meeting where the motion was proposed because just the week before, 6 of the other Waterloo trustees voted to kick him out from future meetings. Now, I don't have time to go into the undemocratic injustice that Mike has been subjected to. So if you don't know the full story on Mike, I implore you to read the local news stories about his removal as trustee, and you'll see that Mike, like others, have paid a heavy price trying to blow the whistle on the radical agenda promoted by many of the trustees and other leaders of the WRDSB. So back to our story. Mike wasn't there, but Cindy was able to present her motion on the CRT issue. The motion, calling for details and transparency about CRT in the classroom, was quickly defeated. The majority of the Waterloo trustees were absolutely against parents or anyone knowing what was being taught about white privilege and anti-racism. The hostility against openness and transparency was so great that the opposing trustees verbally attacked their colleague, Cindy Watson, for daring to represent her constituents. One colleague suggested that bringing forth the motion had done harm. She said, quote, "I would suspect that our staff, our students, and families have had to deal with hate and racism as a result of this motion." Seriously? Asking a question about curriculum was equivalent to hate and racism? But the most negatively affected by this particular motion was the director of education, G. Wanchanika. The introduction of the motion caused him to weep openly. Before he broke down during the board meeting, he'd taken to social media. He was explaining why he didn't want critical race theory lesson plans being made available to parents. He said just the act of discussing the motion, never mind revealing what gets taught, was making children in the board suicidal. Do we really believe that children were watching the board meetings online and were feeling suicidal because their parents might get to see lesson plans? Well, we don't know that, but we do know this for sure. Using the potential suicide of a child to coerce parents into silence is an outrageous abuse of power. And here's what else we know. Our Director of Education never provided any evidence for his claim. And this is some heavy-handed activity. So we have to ask, why would certain trustees in our school board and even the Director of Education resort to what looks like emotional blackmail, all in the name of shutting down discussion? Why were the majority of these trustees so determined to make sure that parents wouldn't know what their kids were being taught in the name of anti-racism education? Well, we can make a pretty good guess. These bullies of the school board don't want parents to know what's really taught, because when they find out, parents are horrified and they scream for change. If you have any doubt, look what just happened down the road in the Hamilton Wentworth School Board. Just a few weeks ago, in mid-September, the Hamilton Wentworth Board sent out a survey to parents of students in their schools. The survey asked them for their thoughts on the board's new anti-racism policy. It was explained that getting their thoughts was important because the ideas and content of that policy would go on to inform the anti-racist instruction in the classroom. Well, the strong majority of parents were shocked at what they read, and they rejected it outright. In fact, here's what the board's own report concluded about parental reaction. 2/3 of survey participants were opposed to the implementation of the anti-racism policy and the ideas it promoted. According to the report, parents specifically condemned the policy, saying, "I am against this policy because it encourages discrimination, when all children are the same and should be treated the same. I am against this policy because school boards should be focused on teaching academics, not this. I am against this policy because it perpetuates racism by making it the focus of everything, and it treats black people as if they were not self-sufficient. I'm against this policy because it doesn't mention anything about racism against whites. I am against this policy because it will divide instead of unite." So that's what parents had to say when they saw what CRT stands for. I'd like to tell you that the trustees and the Hamilton board listened to the voices of this strong majority of parents, but you know they didn't. Despite the outcry, that anti-racism policy and the instruction that will flow from it is going ahead. Now, I know you're not surprised that the board officials didn't listen, because you're beginning to see a pattern here. The pattern is that most of our school boards have been hijacked by activists. They're promoting their own radical ideologies, and they have no regard for parents' wishes or empirical evidence. And to drive that point home, let me give you one last example. It's from my own Waterloo board, the WRDSB. This example is a little bit more personal for me because it involves a presentation that I gave. I appeared before my local trustees in June at the last board meeting. It was just prior to summer. By way of context, my presentation before the board took place after Cindy Watson's CRT motion, after it was shut down. And let's remember, when the majority of the trustees shot down that motion, their goal was to suppress the information about CRT. So I made it my mission to do the research that they said should not be done, and I presented it to them. And the conclusions were damning. Quoting peer-reviewed studies, one after another, I showed that instruction based in critical race theory, including anti-racist instruction, does not do what it promises. It promises it's a treatment for the problem of racism, that it'll make the problem better, and that simply is not true. I showed there's no evidence that it does any good. In fact, there is absolutely no evidence that it makes people less racist. On the other hand, the research does show it can cause people to be more racist. And the research is clear. It absolutely does harm. Now, I'm just giving you a summary now. I'm not quoting the actual journal articles or the authors, because you can look up that yourself. If you want to hear the details, the recording of my full presentation before the board is available on my YouTube channel. And if you do find the time to watch, you will hear all that my local trustees heard, and you will see that they did nothing. It's true. I've gotten nowhere with trustees. Others have gotten nowhere with their school boards. But I'll tell you, it did make a little bit of an impact on social media. My presentation did get the attention of a few teachers. There were some who expressed gratitude. They said, thank you. Thank you for doing the research that our board refused to do. But there were other teachers who condemned me for providing the research that I did. In their eyes, only activists who are promoting more anti-racism education deserve to be heard. Now, I want you to take a look. Take a look at this actual social media post. This is a high school English teacher in the Waterloo board. And I want you to see this social media post that she directed at me so that you can witness how critical race theory scrambles someone's brain. This woman, in full view of the public, where anyone could read it, tells me that the research I just shared with the trustees was not valid because the scholars who did the study were white. This woman, who has direct influence over high school students, thinks it is perfectly legitimate to proclaim you should not be allowed to put forth your ideas, that in fact your ideas are a load of crap if you are white. Now, this is a textbook example of real racism, and this teacher is oblivious. And she's white. She says, you shouldn't pay attention to white scholars. Knock, knock. But this is how anti-racism instruction scrambles your brain. It'd be funny if it wasn't so horrifying. This woman who would condemn someone because of the color of skin is the embodiment of anti-racism instruction, and she's teaching your children. And there are thousands like her. Okay, I started this talk with a story about fraudulent medicines. A drug company promised a new way to make things better, and they made things worse. Finally, a day of reckoning came along with the biggest fine in the history of fraud. Well, let's make the connection. The medicine our school boards are prescribing today to cure the sickness of racism is fraudulent and faulty as the drugs of those of the past. And it's just as harmful. We need to see another day of reckoning, and it can begin October 24th in our municipal elections. We all need to vote for school board trustees who will treat all students with fairness and respect, honor the wishes of parents, and finally, please God, put evidence over ideology. Thank you.
And we will move on to the next delegation, and that is David Millard Haskell, talking about the critical race theory motion. And your 10 minutes, sir, starts right now.
Thank you, and good evening to the chair, trustees, and all the members of the board. My name is David Millard Haskell. I'm a social scientist, researcher, and professor, but tonight I'm here representing the Waterloo Region chapter of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. The short form of our name is the acronym FAIR, and our website is Fair for All. Our chapters are all across the US and Canada. As an organization, FAIR and its members are dedicated to promoting anti-discriminatory, pro-human values that unify society. In particular, I'm here tonight on behalf of FAIR and the local parents who are members and supporters because we're very concerned about the imbalance and what many see as censorship related to discussions about anti-racism education in our board. In violation of the bylaws that are meant to govern this board, we see that we are finding the concerns of parents are not being heard. For example, Section 4.3 of your Waterloo Public Board bylaws say, trustees shall be expected to A, make decisions in a manner which is open, and B, approach all board issues with an open mind, and C, respect different points of view. These legal expectations have been ignored. My comments tonight must be viewed in light of those legal requirements. Specifically, my comments tonight will focus on last week's refusal by the majority of trustees to allow any exploration into the teaching of white privilege and the influence of critical race theory within our board. Of course, I'm referring to the motion by Trustee Watson that was voted down, and also to the unfair comments that accompanied that rejection. And while this delegation tonight, I'm focusing on the recent rejected motion, it appears there is a troublesome trend. Just in the past few months, we've seen severe and shocking examples of censorship by this board against those wanting to raise alternative views and express concerns that many parents are feeling. But let me get back to the issue at hand, the refusal of this board to allow any exploration or even allow discussion on white privilege or critical race theory in our public schools. What was most shocking about last week's stifling of inquiry were the comments of those voting against the motion. The comments were shocking, not because, well, yes, because they contravened your very own bylaws that insist on open-mindedness and respect for different views. But additionally, they were shocking because they reference virtually no facts. Those watching at home saw that the opposing board members relied primarily on highly emotional language and extreme anecdotal claims to force their will. What should have been a civil discussion at times seemed much like emotional coercion. In fact, rather than rationally debate the merits of instruction in white privilege or critical race theory, we had trustees angrily shut down discussion, claiming that the topic was too emotionally offensive to continue. For example, instead of trying to explain why she was against transparency when it came to what was being taught on critical race theory and white privilege, one trustee simply proclaimed, "We're better than this." I had to wonder, better than what? Better than those who want to get the facts on the issue? I watched, disappointed, as the leaders of our educational system insisted that doing more research and committing to more study to better understand an issue was a bad thing. As a social scientist, I was doubly frustrated that the leaders of our board shut down Cindy Watson's motion, and with it, the chance to find out more about white privilege instruction. Because if you had allowed her motion to proceed, you would have discovered some very concerning peer-reviewed studies. But that exploration was not allowed. So tonight I'll share with you some of the research that is able to be found if you look for it. I'll be submitting these studies for reference to the trustees so they can read them fully. Let me begin. In 2019, a study was published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology General. Dr. Aaron Cooley of Colgate University was the lead researcher. The aim of the study was to measure the effect that lessons on white privilege would have on the attitudes of students. Well, the study found that teaching lessons on white privilege did not make students more sympathetic to students of color or people of color. In fact, it did nothing positive, but it did increase hostility toward poor whites. The researchers concluded, quote, "Learning about white privilege reduces sympathy. increases blame, and decreases external attributions for white people struggling with poverty. In short, they found teaching about white privilege does not do good, but it does do harm. Now, here's a second study that also shows the harm that comes from teaching white privilege. And it was just from last month, in May. A study was published in the journal PLOS One, spelled PLOS One. The lead researcher was Christopher Quarles from the University of Michigan. The research involved an experiment to see how introducing the concept of white privilege would affect online discussions on issues specifically related to racial equity. The researchers found that introducing the concept of white privilege shuts down open discussion and lowers support for racial harmony. They concluded, quote, mention of white privilege seems to create discussions that are less constructive, more polarized, and less supportive of racially progressive policies. Furthermore, they stated the concept of white privilege made previously supportive whites less engaged in the conversation and led to less constructive responses from whites and non-whites. Now I'll turn to a third massive study. In 2021, a study was published in the Annual Review of Psychology. The lead author was Elizabeth Payluck from Princeton University. Payluck and her colleagues didn't just do a single study, they did a meta-analysis of over 400 existing studies. Their goal was to see if mandatory instruction in diversity, equity, and inclusion works to decrease prejudice and increase harmony. Because instruction about white privilege is one of the core modules in most diversity training programs, this meta-analysis is highly applicable here. After analyzing the outcomes of the over 400 research papers, Payluck and her team concluded this. Despite the bold claims made by people developing and facilitating this kind of instruction, the average impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion training is zero. And while no good is coming from it, there's even more evidence such mandatory equity and diversity instruction does harm. Let me tell you about Harvard professor Frank Dobbin and what he concludes. Commenting on the hundreds of studies that have measured the effects of diversity training, including instruction on white privilege, Harvard sociologist Frank Dobbin agreed it does not do good. But writing in the July 2016 edition of the Harvard Business Review, he concluded, quote, a number of studies suggest diversity training can activate or cause bias or spark a backlash. That's right, the research shows this kind of instruction can cause more prejudice. Therefore, should we be concerned that the Associate Director, Lila Reed, confirmed to the news media last week that the board does do diversity type training with our students? She said it's done through explicit instruction in, quote, social justice, equity, and inclusion. The subject is included in 2 high school courses among numerous and varied frameworks a teacher can choose to discuss. Given what the research has found about this kind of instruction, shouldn't parents be given the detail? Shouldn't there be discussion? I could go on about other research related to stereotype threat. I don't have time. Instead, let me say this. I've highlighted many studies, those that I was able to find in a day. And it should be clear, much more exploration on these issues was needed and still is needed. And let's remember, your own governing guidelines demand that. Racism is real and it is harmful. And for our schools to do much better, we must work towards solutions and strategies proven to bring unity. And those solutions need to be based on evidence and open discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. You used your full time. Trustees, are there any questions for this delegate? Trustee Watson has a question.
Thank you. You had mentioned that you were able to find some of these reports, some of this information within a few days. Are you suggesting that there are a lot more reports out there with respect to some of the comments you made?
Yes. For example, Elizabeth Payluck from Princeton she found 400 studies of this nature. Prior to her study in 2021, she had done an earlier study that found 900. And what she concludes is that the kind of mandatory training that's happening in terms of equity, inclusion, diversity, does not do good. And as Frank Dobbin from Harvard found, it is clear that it can do harm.
Thank you.
Other questions, trustees? Seeing none, your delegation is complete, Mr. Haskell, and you may leave the meeting.